Our next exciting guest is David Solomon, who is a proud husband, father, and internationally acclaimed global roaming scholar, teacher, writer, and translator. He teaches Jewish history, Tanakh, Jewish philosophy, Hebrew, and Kabbalah. David holds degrees in anthropology, English literature, translation studies, and media broadcasting. His book and series, The Whole of the Jewish History in 1 Hour, and his podcast, The Collected Talks of David Solomon, which can be found on his website, davidsolomon.online, provide entertaining, fascinating, and accessible educational insights into many essential areas of Jewish learning. David, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. Please, can I ask you, as a historian, teacher, and translator of Kabbalah, can you please tell us a brief history of Kabbalah and how it resonates with you?
Oh, well, thank you for that amusing introduction, Tully. I see you stuck to the instructions I gave Rabbi Khan very well. And the reality is that, in fact, Rabbi Khan could attest to the fact that I've been on the phone to him almost every day in the last week, trying to find out what it is I should talk about tonight. Because given that I spend most of my time immersed in the world of Kabbalistic ideas and the world of Kabbalistic texts, it's difficult sometimes, especially without any specifics, to talk about things in a sensible way that's meaningful for the people that are with us tonight. But your question is a piece of guidance that I've been looking for all week. And whilst my discussions with Rabbi Khan were very fruitful, that's really helpful, Tully, so thank you. But I'm going to talk about the historical aspects. But before I do, I want to just make one little insight into that question itself, because it's important for us to understand that the term Kabbalah and the subject of Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism generally can be understood in a different number of ways. There are many, many pathways in and out of that particular domain. But it's important to realize that Kabbalah as a subject and as a set of ideas, as inspiring and as deep as they are, is not necessarily a separate thing from Jewish history. Jewish history, in fact, is the unfolding of its own form of revelation. And that much of Kabbalah seeks to understand what that revelation is that is being revealed and unfolded in history. As I often have said, and those of you who've seen me speak before will know, I've often said that the Jewish people do not survive from generation to generation to hand down the recipe for gefilte fish. We survive for a purpose. That purpose is to reveal the oneness of the divine in the world, and ultimately to bring the world to a better place, to what some might call a messianic consciousness, but not just a messianic consciousness, which we find plenty of in history, but a messianic reality. That is a world at peace, the Jewish people in the land of Israel, and God's plan fully revealed in the world for the dignity and stability of humankind going forward. The aim of all of that, in this particular cycle of history, cosmically, is really to bring about the beginning of human history. And that is our task. But that is illustrated by a series of emanations and a series of revelations in the world that bring about the Jewish people's intimate involvement with what we might call mysticism. Mysticism is really ultimately an understanding that this reality that we see about us is not really what's going on. That the ultimate reality is a spiritual reality that vibrates at a slightly different frequency. But if you open yourself up to that frequency, if you open yourself up to those vibrations, then you suddenly have a perception and an experience of the true reality, which is the divine reality in the world. And so those revelations that have happened throughout history are worth talking about. And after that kind of waffling introduction, Tully, I'm going to now answer your question. And let me say also that it's not an easy question to answer. We've got to contract a whole lot of things. So there are some people who are going to watch this and go, oh, I can't believe he said that. It was so obvious. And there are others who are going to go, oh, I don't know what he was talking about. And there are others who are going to go, I know what he was talking about, but it's nonsense. But I can't address everybody's, no, it's not nonsense, but I can't address everybody's concerns. So we have to do the historical overview that I want to do, but it's very, very important to understand it. When we talk about Jewish mysticism as it was in the times of Chazal, say in the times of the Talmudic period, especially the early Talmudic period, the period that Rabbi Kahn spoke about when the rabbis that went into Pardes, our understanding of the nature of mysticism, our understanding the nature of how we could acquire a deeper understanding of reality through that which is not commonly known, through that which is hidden, through that which is secreted by the divine itself. We saw it in terms of really an ascent. That is, a person purifies themselves, makes themselves holy enough, becomes sufficiently righteous and spiritual, and goes through all sorts of preparations in order to be able to go up in a spiritual sense and to ascend to experience the divine. And that's the classic case of the Arba'a Shenichnasu LePardes, the 4 rabbis that went into paradise, and with all of the different outcomes happening there. It was an ascent experience. The relationship between us and the divine was, in a sense, and essentially a vertical relationship. If you want to know what's going on up there, then you need to go up there and have a look and experience for yourself. If you're not ready for that experience and you try it, there are going to be dangerous outcomes. One of the reasons why Kabbalah has always kind of been attenuated by this sense of the dangerous, that it's not for everyone, that you shouldn't learn it till you're a certain age or a certain situation, that you might go mad, that you might lose your faith. And we have seen examples of that all along. But this perception is based on the idea that we need to ascend to God, that somehow God is up there, and if we ascend, we can do it. And much of ancient Jewish mysticism is based on that idea. If we look at the concept particularly of the Merkava, those of you who are familiar with the Merkava will, well, concept of being familiar with the Merkava is a bit oxymoronic, but the idea is that the Merkava is the chariot of God described in the first chapter of the book of Yechezkel, and I might come back to that in a few minutes, and that that text of Ezekiel chapter 1 is the basis of much of what the rabbis understood by being the divine chariot and how that could be accessed and what the function of that revelation is. So Merkava mysticism was really the mainstay of Jewish mysticism for a long time. There were other, because there was a division between Ma'aseh Merkava, that is those who went into chariot mysticism and ascended up, and Ma'aseh Bereshit, those who delved into the secrets of creation, such as through books like Sefer Yetzirah and so on, where you understand the atomistic nature of reality, how the whole of this reality is really one giant code of an Aleph Bet, a divine Aleph Bet that builds the reality like a DNA. And that is a very, very deep level of mystical introspection that in some ways is still with us. And those two themes carry forward. But what we find is that by the time we get to the Middle Ages, and when I say the Middle Ages, I mean, you know, anything from kind of 1000, 1100 onwards, the high Middle Ages, we start to see a shift. We start to see ideas that are being revealed that are quite different from what was going before. And they reach their apex at the end of the 13th century in what we understand to be the revelation of the Tsar. The Tsar is a very, very different kind of revelation going on. And before we touch upon that exactly, just to summarize it in our historical overview, it's probably worth talking about why a work like the Zohar was revealed at that time. Because as you would know, the Zohar itself says that it was composed based on teachings by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who lived well over 1,000 years before. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is, as Rabbi Shapiro pointed out, was a student of Rabbi Akiva. He's living in the 2nd century. He's a Tana. He's a contributed to the Mishnah, but we're moving 1100 years later to the end of the 13th century, and suddenly his writings and his teachings and his thoughts are being revealed. Why? And it would be wonderful in this group if I could say why and see what people think, but we probably don't have the luxury of doing that, Tully. So I'm going to say what I think is the answer to that. And that is that when we, what's significant about the year 1240, a lot of people don't realize, the year 1240, if you just count back mathematically, was the year 5000. We have a very ancient tradition, a tradition actually that combines Jewish mysticism and Jewish history, where every millennium of Jewish history, and we're going to have 6 millennia, we've got 6 millennia to fix the world, and we're now in 5780, so time is running out. But every millennium of the world equals a day of creation. And so therefore, once you get to the year 1240 in secular counting, and you hit the year 5000, moving forward, you are now in Friday, and you are now in the day in which Adam was created, humanity, the apex of creation. And so what we start to see from the middle of the 13th century onwards, not just in Jewish thought, and not just in Jewish mystical thought, but in world thought generally, we start to see the rise of humanism, and we start to see the rise of the self, and we start to see the rise of ideas that are going to change the world in philosophy and in economics and in politics and in thought generally. And all of those are reflections of a revelation that is going on in history as far as the Jewish people are concerned. Because what we see in the Zohar and in the material that leads up to the revelation of the Zohar, such as the Sefer HaBahir and other works of that nature, is we start to see this idea emerge that the divine interacts with the world in a way that is self-revealing on the one hand, but in a way that is comprehended through humanity itself. We don't really have time in this session to go into the whole idea of the 10 Sfirot, the 10 primary modes of creative energy that emerge and emanate from the divine, and that form of themselves what we call Dmut HaAdam, that is a human form. Not, and it's very important to emphasize this whenever we say those terms, not because, God forbid, we imagine the divine in human form, but because we are this form, because we are microcosmic packages of divine creative potential. It's us who are the reflection. And therefore, once we understand that, what that then begins to emerge in this revelation of the Zohar around this time, what begins to emerge is not a vertical relationship where we are going up to God to experience the divine, but in fact that the divine is being revealed here in this world and to us as human beings for the purpose of bringing the world to that divine consciousness. So the Zohar deals with primarily the Sfirot. Those people who have not read the Zohar, first of all, you can read the Zohar without necessarily understanding that. It's a stunningly beautiful poem, and although it's in Aramaic, it's thousands of pages long and it's in Aramaic, it has been translated. But even if you were to read it on the surface, you would find deep inspiration from it. It's effectively a commentary on the Torah, but just underlying the surface, if you understand the symbolic framework of the Zohar, that it's dealing with the Sfirot. Yeah. Do I have host powers here, Tully? Can I share a screen or not?
Yes, I think you should be able to, yes.
I should be able to. Just because I'm talking about the 10 Sfirot, so I want people to understand what I'm saying. Yep. This is not a very good diagram. It's a bit on the advanced side for some people, but I'm just showing you. We're not going to go through all of the names of the Sfirot now, but God, everything in the universe unfolds according to a creative dynamic that can be understood in its pure emanatory form, something like this. if we were to look at it diagrammatically, but in fact can also be understood to represent the human form as the primary vehicle by which the divine is revealed to humans. The problem is that the Zohar, whilst it was an enormous revelation, isn't necessarily a revelation for a lot of people, because it's a very difficult book to understand. First of all, it's in Aramaic. It is the absolute text par excellence of all Kabbalah. We can speak about separating out the concept of Kabbalah from Jewish mysticism round about this time as well, or a little bit before. Everything that deals with the Sfirot, the dynamic interactions of the divine and the revelations of those interactions to us, we can call that Kabbalah. There are other Jewish mystical systems, even ones that are coming out at the time. Many of the listeners here this evening will know, for example, of a figure like Rabbi Avraham Abulafia, who is also living around the 13th century, who is taking Jewish mysticism in an entirely different direction, not so much with the Sfirot, but much similar and closer to what we would call yogic practices of breathing, meditation, because Abulafia was primarily concerned with the attainment of prophecy. Abulafia was someone who believed that the writings of the Rambam, Maimonides, in his famous philosophical work defending the synthesis of Judaism and Aristotle, Abulafia was telling you, no, that's not a philosophical text. In fact, what the Rambam has written is a deeply mystical text. And what he's doing is showing you how you can achieve prophecy. But I'm going to explain to you, Abulafia says, what you actually do in techniques to achieve that, because prophecy is achievable. Other strands of Jewish thought regard prophecy as something that you can't work towards. It's kind of just bestowed upon you, zap, by God, because God decides you're going to be a prophet. But Abulafian mysticism is getting a resurgence at the moment. That's why I mentioned it, because people might want to contextualize that. It has its origins at a similar time at the Zohar, but quickly went underground for a variety of reasons. But if we go back to the Zoharic story, we go back to the Zohar is a very difficult book, apart from the fact it's very long. And I don't know if you heard about it, but in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, they didn't exactly have printing, and they didn't have, you couldn't go down to your local bookstore and get a copy of the Zohar. It wasn't so easy to get hold of, and when you got hold of, it was thousands of pages of densely written Aramaic. Not an easy thing to look. And even if you could read it, and even if you could understand it, no one really understood it. Well, maybe a few did, but it took more than a couple of centuries for the ideas of the Zohar to start becoming more and more revealed, and ultimately absorbed within Jewish consciousness, and start to really produce incredible fruits of insight in Jewish mysticism and in the divine. And the catalyst for that, and just before I tell you the catalyst for the really important change, I just want to say one more thing about the revelation of the Zohar, because if I don't say this, I'll be annoyed with myself, is that it's not just that we had the advent of the year 5000, that we moved into this kind of millennium of the human, which is going to take us up to the end of the 6th millennium in a full encounter with the divine. And not only, and that whole realignment from a vertical to a horizontal relationship with the divine, but also it was an extremely important point in history. Those of you who are familiar with history, at least in some degree, will know that the end of the 13th century is the end of an enormous struggle. It's not really the end of it, because it's a struggle that's been going on till our own times. But it kind of was a bit of a geopolitical pause in the great struggle between two enormously influential spiritual ideologies that had come out of the Jewish people itself, and that is Islam and Christianity. By the end of the 13th century, basically the Crusades were over, and when the dust settled, Islam had conquered the Middle East and had won that 200-year war against Western Christianity, whereas Christianity had won Spain and the entire Iberian Peninsula, and had ended that couple of 100 years war against Islam that was happening in Spain. So the Zohar coming out, and then you can see that in the Zohar's opening words of Kushoshana ben Achochim kin ra'yati ben abanot. The Zohar quotes from Shir HaShirim, like a rose between the thorns. They see the people of Israel as this rose that is caught between these two giant competing ideologies, both of which must be overcome by history, but both of which emerged from within the Jewish people themselves in a number of different ways. I know that's a radical statement for some to hear, but that is a very provable thing. So, moving forward, we see another crisis in history that is going to take, and I just want to say this, because it wouldn't be me if I didn't say something a little contentious and radical, because there are some people who seem to be going, what's Islam and Christianity got to do with it? I'm here to tell you that Islam and Christianity are not merely some random events. They are deep spiritual forces in the world that Kabbalists talk about, representing the concept of Esav and the concept of Ishmael. And we know from Chazal and we know from Kabbalah that at the end of the day, Christianity and Islam will both arrive at tikkun. They will both arrive at a situation where their contribution to the world is positive. But that can only happen through amelioration through the Jewish people. But we get to the next really big nexus in history for the Jewish people, and that, of course, is the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century. Don't know if you heard about it, but there was this enormous cataclysm and upheaval in the Jewish world at the end of the 15th century, at the end of the 15th century, because the Jews were expelled from Spain. And I'm here to tell you that the expulsion from Spain and shortly after from Portugal was nothing less than the Jews being told within a few months, today, for example, God forbid this should happen, that all the Jews of America have to leave. Not so unbelievable as it happens, but nevertheless, that is a similarity to what happened in Spain. And that meant that there was a huge outpouring of Jews everywhere, but also a cosmic upheaval that was seen by Kabbalists as heralding something deeply foundational and important that was happening in the Jewish world. And indeed it was. And we saw that in the wider world as well. We see the end of the 15th, the beginning of the 16th century, immense changes in the world, not just the rise of printing, the age of exploration, advances in science and so on, and ways in which our modern world was not quite there yet, but we can start to see emerging. And suddenly the Jewish people are on the move, and our thoughts are once again being given to what is the meaning of exile. We've been in exile now for 1,500 years back in the 16th century, and it's about time it ended. And now the world is in upheaval. Surely now is a time where we can see serious revelations of the divine that can help us to understand this exile. Not so dissimilar to what Rabbi Shapiro was talking about when he talked about how in the moments of deep oppression and in moments of difficulty and challenge is when we see that we're actually being reborn to something new. And that is why during the 16th century, I'm just looking at the time, I have to make sure, that during the 16th century, we know that one of the, as one door closes, another opens, and we know that it was the Ottoman Empire that accepted hundreds of thousands of Jews into the Ottoman Empire and found places for them, and they welcomed Jews. And so obviously Jews flourished there. And we see that in places like Salonika and even in Istanbul, it's in Constantinople itself, and even in the land of Israel, Jews were allowed to return to the land of Israel. However, a lot of people don't realize is that the Ottomans were well aware of Jewish messianic expectations. And so they didn't really want many Jews going to Jerusalem. We've spoken about this in other talks on the 16th century. People who are interested in that are welcome to find those talks. But in the 16th century, we could go back to the land of Israel, but it was kind of limited. And the Ottomans wanted us to center more on places that were economic development zones for them. And it just so happened that one town in the north of Israel was very important to the Ottoman Empire, and that was the town of Safed, the town of Tzfat. And so in the 16th century, Tzfat became, even before it became a center of mysticism, it became a center of commerce and activity and flourishing Jewish communal life. But that itself attracted some of the greatest sages, mystics among them, from places like Adrianople and from places like Salonika and so on, to move to Tzfat to set up the most perhaps amazing cultural revolution we've ever had in Jewish history, a revolution in Jewish law, because the Shulchan Aruch itself was produced there, and a revolution in Jewish thought, and particularly in Jewish mysticism. And that is where, I can't go into too many individual figures because we will get lost, but that is where someone like Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, who had previously sat for quite a number of years, 7, 10, different opinions, on an island in the Nile, and then took his copy of the Zohar and went to Tzfat. The thing is that the Zohar had been printed for the first time. This is part of the massive revelation, the printing of the Zohar in Mantua in 1558. And printing is, I don't need to tell you, it means printing. It means you can read it, you can access it, you can buy it from your bookshop, if you, I mean. But, and turned up, and when, of course, Rabbi Isaac Luria turned up, and all these great mystics are already living there, they just thought he was another guy come, you know, from somewhere else. He's come to Tzfat, he's come to sit at our feet and learn. But it very soon became clear that the Ari was not there to learn. The Ari was there to teach. And what the Ari did is he unpacked the Zohar in a way that was nothing short of completely transformative and revolutionary, and that all subsequent Kabbalah really has drawn from the wellsprings of the Ari. It is the Ari who gave us the idea that God self-contracts to create the world. The idea that something out of nothing, where is the nothing in a God that is everything, is that God has self-contracted to create the world. All of these are very, very profound and deep spiritual concepts. The idea of the smashing of the vessels, the idea that, an idea alluded to in the Zohar, but no one really understood what it meant. When the Sefer Tzniuta says, O Malchin Kadmain Metu V'Zionei Lo Ishtakchu, no one really knows what that means until the Ari comes and completely unpacks it in the fact that light comes into the world, but vessels that are not capable of holding that light crack. But ultimately we have tikkun, the whole idea of tikkun olam, fixing the world, that we participate with God in the reconstruction of the world, is a profound idea that once again emerges out of Lurianic thought in Tzfat. And these revelations were immense, and the Ari was only in Tzfat for a couple of years, and then he died. And most of them were written down by his students, notably Rabbi Chaim Vital, but also Rabbi Yisrael Sarug. A bit late, I hope that's okay. If I get a thumbs up from Rabbi Khan, then I'll do that for just 2 more minutes. I don't want to keep the holy Rabbi Jacobson waiting. But ultimately, last time I saw Simon Jacobson actually was over 10 years ago. I had a coffee with him in the old city. I look forward to seeing him again. Ultimately, all of Kabbalah since the Ari really has tried to come to terms with the ideas of the Ari. But what's important for me to state, and I'm going to kind of make this point and then run away and hide, is that, and I think it's important to state this at an event that is sponsored by more or less by Chabad, because people know that I'm very much a Chabad empath, but it's very important to understand that there are many, many different pathways into Jewish mysticism. And Chassidut on the one hand, and within Chassidut, the framework of Chabad Chassidus, which is an infinitely profound and inspiring mode of thought and discourse, is nevertheless but one pathway into Jewish mysticism. What I would recommend people to do is to go back to the texts themselves, have a look at what Kabbalistic books are saying. And there are many, many pathways. Just the 18th century alone sees the rise of Hasidism. It sees the rise of the Rashash of Shalom Sharabi in that entire mode of, which belongs more in the East, but of bringing the teachings of the Ari into our life and our prayer. The whole school of the Elijah the Gaon of Vilna, of the Gra, which seeks to understand the Torah, the Kabbalah as a dimension of Torah, But ultimately, all of these seem to have one thing in common, and that is they are bringing the revealed divine into this world. No longer do we have a vertical relationship. We are now seeking a horizontal relationship with the divine, where the divine is revealed in this world. And the project really of the last century, if we look at Kabbalistic texts, we look at Kabbalistic ideas, and this is true whether people realize it or not, whether people inside these systems realize it or not, is that we are climbing, I don't know why I use the word climbing, but we are moving towards a synthesis of all of these different paths. If you look at Kabbalistic texts, even coming out of Hasidic schools themselves, Kabbalistic texts are starting to synthesize all of the different paths of Kabbalah of the last 300-400 years into a system of divine revelation that will ultimately affect the world. This is the task of the Jewish people. There will always be parts of the divine that are hidden to us, but there will always be the yearning of humanity to want to participate with God in knowledge about the world. And the revolutions of Luria and Kabbalah, both in Jewish thought and in wider thought, have been enormous. And we have spoken about that in other places. If I could end on just one note, I was actually originally going to speak about one person that would kind of exemplify this. I was going to talk about one of the students of the Ari, perhaps a little lesser known student, Rabbi Yisrael Sarug. And I'm not going to talk about him for much, but there is an idea that I've been mulling over quite a lot lately because I've been working with some of his writings. And he has a different beginning of the universe than Rabbi Chaim Vital. Rabbi Chaim Vital, when he describes Luria's thought, because the Ari didn't write anything down, when he's describing the Lurianic system of how the world's unfolded, he starts with the famous concept of Tzimtzum, the contraction of God into itself to create the space for humanity. But in fact, Rabbi Yisrael Sarug goes higher than that, and he tells you there's a process that happens before that, and that is based on the midrash that the thought of the righteous arose in God's mind. What that means is that we here in this world create this world because we have to live in a way that justifies its existence. That's the meaning of the word tzaddik. And that thought of the righteous causes God to have what Sarug calls na'anuim, which are literally vibrations of happiness. Just as a person gets happy, they start to vibrate, so is the divine vibrating. The whole world is built on the notion of cosmic vibrations of happiness, which is a really beautiful thought that I sometimes go back to in these times, especially which are times that are challenging, is that as challenging as they are, they don't they don't absolve us of the responsibility of understanding that this world, the existence of this world, depends on righteous living. And it depends on people living in such a way that would justify the existence of this world for their sake. And that is true on an individual level, that is true on a collective level. It's true for the individual, it's true for the Jewish people, and it's also true for the whole of humanity. So we need to see these challenges, we need to break through them, but we need to grow and grow in revelation. And it's difficult to summarize what all the details and ideas that Kabbalah gives us and the tools it gives us in order to do that. But I hope that maybe I've just done an arc over some of the more important historical moments and showing how the revelation of the divine, because that revelation of the Ari is not a simple revelation. It's a revelation that ultimately leads to redemption. It leads to, because that's been the story of the Jewish people of the last 500 years, and we have achieved much in that project. We have a state of Israel, we have a unified Jewish world, we have a global culture, we have a global potential for global divine consciousness, but we are still trying to bring about the ultimate revelation of the divine, which is the concept of a world peace.
Thank you, David. Do you know what Moshe actually did say to me earlier today, that you were brilliant, so he didn't need to give you guidance in the form of a question. And I know I wasn't allowed to give you compliments in my introduction, even though I wanted to, but now you can't stop me. I can understand why your fans have called you the best Torah infotainment and why you have such a large following. And after hearing you tonight and also listening to many of your talks on your website, which I'd like to remind everyone, because I'm sure everyone would like to listen to them. It's davidsolomon.online, and your 50th episode is coming out this week. But after listening to a lot of them this week, I totally can understand why you're so sought after and why your talks are always sold out. So thank you for being here.
You're very kind, Tali, and thank you to you and Rabbi Khan and all the others responsible for putting together such an amazing event. Really.
Pleasure. Not kind. It's all true. Thank you so much.